The obsidian sky, a canvas I had spent a lifetime dissecting, offered little solace these nights. My observatory, perched like a sentinel on the craggy backbone of the Forgotten Mountains, was less a sanctuary and more a self-imposed prison. Dust motes danced in the anemic glow of my monitor, mimicking the celestial ballet I sought to comprehend. Yet I felt a profound disconnection from the grand cosmic dance. My reclusiveness was a shield, forged in the crucible of a past trauma that still clung to my periphery like a persistent, formless shadow. Every hum of equipment, every click of a relay, was a deliberate barrier between myself and the echoing void within. I traced the familiar constellations on my screen, my fingers calloused from years of navigating complex interfaces. Most nights, the data flowed predictably, a comforting lullaby of known physics. Tonight, however, a subtle dissonance began to prick at the edges of my focus. It started as a blip, an anomaly in the background radiation that my automated filters initially dismissed. I overrode the protocols, zooming into the coordinates that had triggered the faint warning. There, nestled amongst the familiar tapestry of distant galaxies, was not a star, not a nebula, not even a conventional black hole. It was an absence. A perfect, impossible nullity where light simply ceased to exist, not bent or absorbed, but utterly unmade. My breath hitched. My instruments, calibrated with painstaking precision, registered no gravitational lensing, no accretion disk, none of the telltale signs of a cosmic devourer. It was a tear, a perfect circular puncture in the fabric of existence itself, a lacuna that defied every principle of astrophysics I held sacred. I named it simply the Lacuna. Such a thing should not be. It was an affront to the very geometry of space, a violation of the elegant rules that governed our reality. I spent hours, then days, recalibrating my arrays, cross-referencing data with every available public and private observatory. Nothing. No one else saw it. It was as if the lacuna existed solely for my eyes, a private, terrifying revelation. Then came the signal. Not a radio wave in the conventional sense, not electromagnetic. My spectral analysis software choked, then crashed. The waveform was wrong. It didn't fit into any known classification. It had no discernible frequency, yet it possessed a rhythmic pulse. It felt like a concept trying to manifest as energy. My hands, usually steady as bedrock, trembled as I manually reconfigured the primary receiver. I needed absolute isolation, an environment free from the slightest terrestrial interference. My mind immediately went to the abandoned mine, a few miles down the winding mountain path. For years, it had served as a storage space for my more experimental shielded equipment, a place where the world's clamor couldn't penetrate. Its deep granite veins offered a natural Faraday cage, a perfect crucible for something so utterly alien. I packed a minimal kit, a portable spectrum analyzer, a reinforced data drive, and a thermos of bitter coffee. The drive down the treacherous dirt track was a blur, the old Jeep rattling and groaning in protest. The mine entrance, a rusted steel gate sagging on broken hinges, loomed like a forgotten tombstone. I pushed it open, the screech of metal echoing into the damp, lightless tunnel. The air was cool, thick with the scent of damp earth and old metal. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, snaked down my spine. My makeshift lab within the mine was a single reinforced chamber, dug deep into the bedrock. I had spent months reinforcing it, insulating it, making it impervious to external noise and seismic tremors. It was here that I installed the specialized receiver, a device of my own design, built to detect the most subtle fluctuations in space-time. My fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting the coordinates of the lacuna. The screen flickered, then resolved into a stream of data. The signal was stronger here, clearer. It pulsed, not in a simple periodic rhythm, but with a complex fractal cadence that seemed to fold back on itself. It was a melody composed of non-Euclidean angles, a symphony of impossible dimensions. My analyzer struggled, its algorithms failing to find a pattern, to categorize the input. It was like trying to fit a sphere into a two-dimensional plane, or to grasp a concept that existed outside the very framework of logic. My eyes burned, fixed on the chaotic, beautiful readout. The waveform shifted, not just in amplitude or frequency, but in its very form. It was as if the signal itself was a living entity, constantly reorganizing its internal geometry. This wasn't merely an unknown phenomenon. It was an active defiance of reality. Then, a subtle shift occurred. The air in the chamber, already heavy, seemed to thicken further. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible distortion, a visual tremor that made my vision swim. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, attributing it to fatigue. But the feeling persisted. The static hum of the equipment seemed to gain a new, unsettling resonance. A low thrum that vibrated not just in my ears, but in my very bones. I looked around the concrete room, the familiar objects now seeming subtly wrong. A corner of the workbench appeared to recede into itself, only to snap back into place when I focused directly on it. My breath caught in my throat. The signal was not merely an observation. It was an intrusion. It was beginning to bleed into my reality, twisting the familiar, unraveling the very threads of my perception. And what if it was beginning to impose its impossible fullness upon my world? The tension in the air was a palpable thing, a taut wire stretching between my sanity and the looming incomprehensible. Dust motes still danced, oblivious, but I was no longer seeing them. My vision had narrowed, tunneling, until only the undulating lines of the signal held any meaning. The obsidian sky, my life's work, had receded, replaced by the relentless, intricate pulse that now filled my screens, my mind, my very breath. Days bled into a singular, formless stretch. The observatory, with its grand dome and panoramic windows, suddenly felt too exposed, too porous to the world's mundane chatter. The signal, subtle as it was, seemed to whisper of deeper silences, of an isolation more profound than the mountain peak could offer. I moved with the precise, almost ritualistic movements of a sleepwalker. My most sensitive receivers, a portable spectrum analyzer, and a stack of data drives were all I deemed essential. Iron gates, rusted and askew, groaned a protest as I forced them open. The entrance to the abandoned mine was a gaping wound in the earth, framed by skeletal timbers that seemed to clutch at the gray sky. I descended, my headlamp a fragile circle against the absolute blackness. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me, a tangible weight. Deeper and deeper I went, past collapsed sidings and forgotten tracks, until I found a small, relatively stable chamber. Here, the world outside ceased to exist. Once the equipment hummed to life, the signal, previously faint, now surged. It was a torrent of data, a symphony of incomprehensible frequencies that filled the small chamber. I watched it scroll across the screens, a dizzying array of patterns that defied every mathematical principle I knew. My fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting algorithms, attempting to force the chaotic data into recognizable forms. But the signal resisted. It was a geometry I had no language for, a logic that twisted Euclidean space into knots, yet held an undeniable, terrifying coherence. It was as if a sculptor had created a masterpiece from paradox, a structure built on the absence of dimension, yet undeniably present. The patterns were not random noise. They were structured in a way that hinted at intelligence, an alien intellect that perceived reality through an entirely different lens. My mind, trained for decades to find order in the cosmos, was now confronted with an order that shattered the very foundation of order. The impossible was not just possible, it was manifesting on my screens. Hours, then days dissolved into this relentless pursuit. The mind became my entire world, the signal my only companion. Food and water were afterthoughts, my body a mere vessel for the processing of this impossible data. My eyes burned, my head throbbed, but I could not tear myself away. It started subtly. I blamed the dim headlamp, the flickering monitor, the sheer exhaustion. Then, the chamber itself seemed to shift. For a fleeting moment, the rough-hewn rock face opposite me seemed to ripple, its plane bending inwards, then snapping back to its original solid form. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion brought on by sleep deprivation. A sound, too. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the rock beneath my feet, distinct from the gentle thrum of my equipment. But the distortions became more frequent, more insistent. The monitor screen, usually a flat plane of light, seemed to bulge outwards, the data scrolling across its surface appearing to curve into an impossible convex shape. The air in the chamber, already thick with the scent of minerals, occasionally carried a faint metallic tang, like old blood, then vanished. I found myself staring at the rock walls, tracing the patterns of moisture, half expecting them to rearrange themselves into the very non-Euclidean geometries I was seeing on my screen. My scientific training screamed for an explanation, for a rational cause. My body was protesting. My mind was playing tricks. I was tired, profoundly, devastatingly tired. The signal was not merely data, it was presence. And it was beginning to resculpt the very air I breathed, the very ground I stood upon, one imperceptible, impossible shift at a time. I gripped the edge of my folding table, knuckles white, determined to crack its code, even as my own reality began to fray. The obsidian void, the inexplicable hum, it had become the entirety of my existence. A hungry maw at the edge of my perception. I felt the static cling to my skin, a subtle vibration that wasn't in the air but in the very marrow of my bones. Sleep had become a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a distorted fragment of the signal. The first night, it was merely an echo, a faint rhythmic thrum beneath my eyelids. Then came the shapes, geometries that folded in on themselves, angles that defied the very concept of dimension, structures that bloomed and collapsed in an instant, leaving behind a residue of existential nausea. I would wake gasping, my room no longer familiar, the walls seeming to breathe, the corners too sharp, too deep. The air itself felt thick with unspoken questions. I retreated. My small, cluttered apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt porous, too exposed to the mundane world. The city's distant thrum, the neighbor's television, the casual chirping of a bird, all became unbearable intrusions, white noise that obscured the subtler, more terrifying frequencies now permeating my awareness. I stopped answering the persistent rings of my comm unit. The colleagues' calls, the landlord's inquiries, they were just hollow sounds, meaningless echoes from a world I was rapidly leaving behind. The signal, though, was never silent. It was then I remembered the abandoned mine, a relic of a forgotten era, nestled deep in the desolate expanse beyond the city's furthest reach. I packed only essentials. My primary console, a portable power source, a few nutrient bars, and a flask of water. The drive was a blur, the landscape dissolving into a smear of gray and brown. The world outside the vehicle's windows seemed less real with every passing mile, the signal's subtle hum growing louder in my head, a counterpoint to the engine's drone. The abandoned mine swallowed me whole. My footsteps echoed, each crunch of gravel amplified in the cavernous space. I found a relatively stable alcove, far from the light-starved entrance, and began setting up my equipment. Here, underground, I thought. Perhaps the world would leave me alone. Perhaps the signal would be weaker, diluted by tons of rock. I was wrong. It was not a sound I heard with my ears, but with some deeper, more nascent faculty. It scraped at the edges of my thoughts, a language without words, a meaning without sense. It spoke of impossibilities, of things that should not be. My eyes, strained from the monitor's glare, began to play tricks. But the memory of the distortion lingered, a phantom limb of sight. The nightmares deepened their assault. One night, I found myself adrift in a sea of pure non-Euclidean geometry. Shapes writhed and twisted, forming impossible tessellations that defied all logic, all spatial reasoning. A cube would unfold into a star, then collapse into a sphere, only to re-emerge as a structure with 14 sides, none of them flat, all of them impossibly sharp. The colors were not colors I knew, but shades of unlight, hues that seemed to absorb my very vision. And the sounds. It was the sound of existence being torn apart, of reality unraveling at the seams. They were not looking at me, but through me, observing the collapse with an ancient, indifferent hunger. Had I screamed? I couldn't remember. The vision of those impossible shapes, the echo of that tearing sound clung to me, staining my waking thoughts. I stared at my hands, flexing my fingers, reassuring myself of their solidity. The reclusive life, the lack of human contact, the incessant focus on the signal. Perhaps it was all finally breaking me. Perhaps the trauma, long buried, was finally resurfacing, manifesting as these elaborate cosmic delusions. It was like a song played backwards, or words spoken in a language I almost knew but never quite grasped. It wasn't just a signal. I was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, with a truth that was unraveling not just my sanity, but the very fabric of the world around me. It was filled with echoes, and they were all for me. Fatigue was a heavy cloak, yet sleep offered no sanctuary. The bookshelves, usually precise rows of knowledge, now appeared to lean inward, their spines converging at an unnatural point on the ceiling. The brain, under duress, could invent such things. I walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The cityscape below, a geometry I had always understood, seemed subtly off-kilter. No, this was absurd. I was projecting, overlaying my internal turmoil onto the external world. My mind, a brilliant instrument, was also a fragile one. Determined to dispel these phantoms, I retreated to my home lab, a sanctuary of precision and verifiable truth. Here, amidst the blinking lights of my supercomputer, the hum of the particle simulator, and the crisp scent of ozone, reality was meant to be unyielding. Perhaps I had misinterpreted the signal, extrapolated too wildly. But even here, the insidious geometry had begun its silent invasion. My primary monitor, usually a perfect rectangle, now held a faint, almost imperceptible trapezoidal warp at its upper right corner. I frowned, tapping the screen. No physical damage. I ran a diagnostic, checking the display calibration. All systems reported optimal. Next, I turned to the optical bench, a meticulously aligned array of mirrors and lasers. Its polished surface, designed for absolute flatness, reflected my image back with a subtle, unnerving bulge, as if the glass itself had buckled inward. I ran my hand over the surface, feeling only the cool, smooth plane. My logical mind clung to these explanations like a drowning man to driftwood. Raj, I murmured to myself, you're overwrought. Sleep deprivation is playing havoc with your perception. I pulled out my precision laser level, a tool of absolute rectitude. If anything was truly askew, this would expose it. I aimed it across the lab, projecting a brilliant crimson line against the far wall. The line, a testament to Euclidean perfection, should have been perfectly straight. My gaze sharpened, my determination hardening. But as I watched, the laser line, though originating from a stable point, seemed to bow ever so slightly in the middle, a minute, graceful curve that defied the very laws of optics. My hands trembled as I repositioned the level, checking its calibration, then its power source. Everything was flawless. I tried again, projecting the line onto my workbench. The same impossible arc. The space itself was bending. The air, the light, The very geometry of my lab was being subtly, horrifyingly rewritten. This wasn't merely internal. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. This was real. I grabbed a digital protractor, its display glowing with precise decimal points, and moved to the corner of my desk. The angle, by all known rules, should be a perfect 90 degrees. I pressed the arms firmly against the surfaces, watching the readout. 89.7. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker, it shifted to 90.3. Then back. The numbers danced, mocking the foundational truths of my world. The corner was not a single fixed angle, but a fluid, wavering one. It was a corner that existed in multiple states, an impossible superposition of form. This was the reveal. The distortions were not just visual, they were physically measurable. It was not merely speaking to me through signals, it was sculpting my reality. I looked around my lab, the room that had always been my bastion of order, now a canvas for an unseen hand. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards to ripple. The very air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unseen dimensions pressing in. My world, the world I knew, was unraveling at the seams, being restitched with threads of madness. And I, Raj, the man who sought to understand the cosmos, was now trapped within its impossible, shifting design. My gaze wavered, not from fatigue, but from a sudden, profound betrayal of perception. The crimson line, an unwavering testament to Euclidean perfection, should have been flawlessly straight against the rough concrete of the far wall in my makeshift lab within the abandoned mine. But it wasn't. It bowed. A subtle, almost imperceptible sag in its precise trajectory, as if the very air had thickened, or space itself had begun to ripple. I blinked, hard, rubbed my eyes until static burst behind my eyelids. I repositioned the laser level, a tool I trusted more than my own shadow, and fired it again. The line, a scarlet scar across the grimy wall, still dipped. A gentle curve, like the belly of a sail catching an impossible wind. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This was not possible. My voice, thin and reedy, seemed alien even to my own ears. The signal. It had to be the signal. My instruments had been picking up its strange, non-Euclidean echoes for weeks. But this was a manifestation, a physical distortion. A frantic energy seized me. I needed more data, more proof, something to anchor myself against this encroaching madness. I plunged back into the glowing array of monitors, my fingers flying across the keyboard, calling up the latest spectral analysis. I isolated a particular frequency band, a complex harmonic structure that had always defied my attempts at conventional decryption. It wasn't noise. It was too intricate, too deliberate. Hours blurred into a single agonizing stretch of focused obsession. Every calculation, every algorithm I applied seemed to unravel at the edges, yielding not answers but further questions, like fractals of incomprehensible meaning. Then, a pattern. Not in the data itself, but in the distortion it imposed on the data. It was as if the signal wasn't just transmitting information, but actively re-encoding the very framework of perception through which I was trying to understand it. My eyes fixated on a series of waveforms, a sequence of undulating peaks and troughs that had, until now, appeared random. But as I applied a novel filtering algorithm, one I'd cobbled together in a moment of desperate inspiration, a structure began to emerge. It wasn't a mathematical equation I recognized, nor a linguistic cipher. It was something else entirely. A grammar of form, a syntax of spatial relations. It was a language, I realized with a sickening lurch, but not one of sounds or symbols. It was a language of geometry, designed to reshape the underlying rules of existence. The signal wasn't just telling me something. It was showing me, forcing my reality to conform to its impossible logic. This was the breakthrough, the horrific revelation that solidified my worst fears. As this understanding solidified, a profound shift occurred around me. The rough-hewn timbers supporting the ceiling above me seemed to sag and then tauten, not with structural strain, but with an impossible elasticity. My lab bench, usually a solid slab of steel, appeared to ripple, its edges blurring into an uncertain haze. I gripped the edge of the bench, my knuckles white, trying to ground myself in its familiar rigidity. But even its surface felt subtly wrong beneath my fingertips. Cool, then warm, then impossibly smooth, like polished bone. My gaze darted to a stack of research papers. The printed words, crisp and black moments before, now writhed, their serifs elongating into thin, spidery limbs, the lines of text curving like calligraphy drawn on a disturbed water surface. A low hum, not from my equipment, but from the very walls of the abandoned mine, vibrated through the soles of my boots. It was a deep, resonant tone that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly within my skull. A sound that implied immense, unimaginable scale. They seemed to possess a strange, angular intelligence, shifting and elongating into forms that defied the logic of my overhead lamps. I saw my mouth open, but no sound emerged. The laser line, still projecting its crimson arc, now pulsed faintly, its impossible curve deepening, becoming a distinct, undeniable bow. It was no longer a defect of the tool or my vision. It was the world itself bowing to an unseen, unimaginable force. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a rhythmic pulse, as if the very ground beneath me was breathing. I stumbled, catching myself on a rack of equipment. The familiar weight of the steel felt suddenly insubstantial, then crushingly heavy, then light as air. My world was unraveling, not slowly, not metaphorically, but with a terrifying, undeniable tangibility. The signal was a blueprint, a set of instructions for a new reality. And I, Raj, had just deciphered its core directive. There was no turning back. The impossible forms were here, and they were beginning to dance. It bowed, subtly, then kinked at an impossible angle, a silent scream of geometry undone. I blinked, hard, rubbing at my eyes, but the distortion held. My equipment, usually a comforting array of logic and precision, now seemed to ripple at its edges. The sharp lines of the oscilloscope casing softening, then sharpening into impossible points. The hum intensified. A low thrumming that felt less like sound and more like a resonant frequency in my very bones. No, I whispered, the words swallowed by the cavernous space. My voice sounded thin, alien. This wasn't a trick of light, or exhaustion, or my own fraying nerves. My mind screamed at the contradiction, a silent internal fracturing. The screen displaying the signal data pulsed with an aggressive alien rhythm. A shiver, profound and unsettling, traced a path down my spine. The hum in the air intensified, pressing against my eardrums, and the distorted crimson line on the wall seemed to breathe, its impossible curve expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the signal. My fingers, trembling slightly, hovered over the interface. I had been seeking patterns, deciphering anomalies. But this was different. This was a dialogue, involuntary and terrifying. The signal was responding to my presence, my focus, my very attempt to comprehend it. It was reaching back. It was beautiful in its terrifying wrongness, a nightmare made manifest. And then, a sense of presence within that impossible architecture, ancient beyond reckoning, an intelligence that had watched the universe unfurl, waiting. Embrace. The impression was a caress of pure glacial malevolence, an invitation to surrender my Euclidean sanity to its vast, incomprehensible order. This was not a scientific discovery. It was an encounter. My eyes, wide and bloodshot, held a desperate glint. I was no longer merely an observer. I was a recipient, and it wanted something from me. A sudden, sharp spike in the signal data, represented by a grotesque, multifaceted bloom of impossible color on the screen, coincided with a sickening lurch in my stomach. The air in the abandoned mine grew heavy, thick with an unseen, unbreathable essence. The very structure of the concrete walls seemed to ripple, to breathe around me. I could feel the presence now, distinctly, pressing against the fragile membrane of my mind. It was not gentle. It was demanding. It was an imperative. A command issued by something that regarded my reality as a malleable toy. I was no longer decoding a signal. I was being spoken to. My mind a receptive vessel for an ancient, malevolent consciousness that sought to twist my world into its own impossible image. The crimson line on the wall, now a vibrant, pulsing vein of pure distortion, seemed to beckon me, urging me to step through the veil of my sanity into the nightmare geometry it promised. The single, wordless thought, a cold breath against my soul, had left me gasping, stranded in the wreckage of my understanding. It wasn't a whisper of alien insight, but a hammer blow of absolute will, an imperative that stripped the very notion of my reality down to a child's crumbling sandcastle. The geometry of my living room, the comforting right angles of shelves and tabletops, began to waver at the periphery of my vision. A book, its spine a familiar shade of faded crimson, seemed to breathe, its pages flexing inwards, then outwards, as if defying the laws of volume. I couldn't trust the air I breathed, much less the solid ground beneath my feet. I needed a place untainted by my immediate observations, a raw, unyielding space where the signal's influence, I foolishly hoped, might be less potent, or at least more discernible against a stark backdrop. My thoughts, frantic and fragmented, coalesced around one desperate idea: the abandoned mine. Its deep, forgotten shafts, its ancient, unyielding rock, felt like the antithesis of the signal's fluid chaos. The drive was a fugue. The road, a ribbon of asphalt I'd traversed countless times, stretched and contracted, its perspective shifting with nauseating ease. Distant trees, their branches skeletal against the bruised sky, would suddenly loom impossibly close, their textures rendered with a hyper-real clarity, only to recede into a blurry wash of green and gray. I pressed the accelerator, a primal urge to outrun the unraveling, but the landscape was a predator, always a step ahead, always waiting. I found the rusting gate to the abandoned mine half open, a skeletal sentinel swallowed by overgrown brambles. I parked my vehicle haphazardly, its tires crunching on loose gravel, and pushed through the narrow entrance to the main shaft. My flashlight beam, a fragile spear, cut through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn timbers, their surfaces slick with moisture, and the glint of stagnant water in unseen puddles. But even here, the geometry was a lie. The tunnel, a straight path into the earth, began to undulate. The wooden supports, meant to be perpendicular to the ground, leaned and twisted, their form suggesting a slow, agonizing rotation. I walked deeper, my boots echoing off walls that refused to stay put. The tunnel branched, or perhaps it didn't, for the passage I had just come through seemed to vanish behind me, replaced by a sheer rock face, wet and unyielding. My mind reeled. Had I imagined it? Had the entrance collapsed? I spun around, my light darting, trying to retrace my steps, but the tunnel ahead was a new configuration, a spiral of diminishing returns, the way back erased. A faint glint of metal caught my eye. An old pickaxe, its handle rotted, lay half buried in the debris. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the distortion persisted. It wasn't just my perception. The object was changing. I moved into a larger cavern, the ceiling lost to the reach of my beam. A pool of water, still and black, reflected the uneven ceiling. I approached it cautiously, drawn by a perverse fascination. My own reflection stared back at me, but it was not quite right. My mouth, when I tried to speak, moved in a disjointed, horrifying way, my lips pulling back to reveal teeth too numerous, too sharp. It was me, yet utterly alien, a stranger wearing my skin, mocking my humanity with its impossible angles. A memory flashed, unbidden, of my mother's face, smiling at me across a sunlit kitchen table. But her eyes in the memory were too wide, her smile too broad, her head tilted at an angle that defied human anatomy. The kitchen itself was a kaleidoscope of impossible colors, the walls curving inwards like the surface of a black hole. It wasn't a memory. It was a perversion, a grotesque twisting of what was once sacred. The world was not just dissolving, it was being rearranged. I was trapped within its impossible logic, a prisoner in a waking nightmare, and the only way out was to fully embrace the terrifying, beautiful madness that was swallowing my world whole. The descent into the abandoned mine was a surrender. My headlamp's beam, a fragile spear of light, pierced the absolute blackness, revealing only the immediate damp rock. I had sought this depth, this forgotten cavity in the Earth's crust, believing that here, far from the sky's deceiving expanse, the signal might reveal itself without cosmic interference. A pure, distilled horror. Each step echoed, a hollow clatter of my boots on loose shale. The tunnel narrowed, the timbers groaning under an unseen weight, like ancient bones shifting in a grave. It wasn't a message to decipher. It was a command, an architect's decree. Here, I set down my equipment, the portable receiver, the spectral analyzer, the recording devices I knew, deep down, would capture nothing but static. Yet I clung to them as totems against an encroaching madness. The headlamp flickered, then died. This was what I'd come for. This was the crucible. Then, the visions began. The blackness wasn't empty. It was full of lines that didn't exist, angles that defied Euclidean geometry. I saw the air itself warp, shimmering with an unseen pressure, as if a colossal, invisible hand were slowly clenching, distorting the very space within the chamber. A corner of my vision showed the rough-hewn rock walls bending inwards, not collapsing, but folding upon themselves in impossible ways, like wet paper being creased by an unseen force. The signal wasn't just influencing my mind, it was actively manifesting, or rather, reshaping my perception of reality to fit its own incomprehensible form. The metallic tang in the air intensified, tasting like old blood and ozone. I could feel the angles, the non-Euclidean curves, pressing against my skull, trying to force their way into my understanding, like a chisel working on granite. A sound, not heard but felt, resonated through my bones. A deep, resonant hum. A thrumming that seemed to originate from beyond the walls of the mine, from beyond the earth itself. And with it, the breakthrough, the horrifying comprehension, burst upon me like a supernova. The signal was not a communication. It was not a message. It was a blueprint. A vast, intricate design, not for a structure, but for a being. An entity so immense, so utterly alien, that its very existence defied the dimensions we inhabited. And the signal was the sound of its hunger. My body convulsed, a ragged gasp escaping my lips. I saw it, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal understanding. The entity's goal was not to destroy, not even to conquer in any conventional sense. It was to integrate. The mine walls, in my mind's eye, ceased to be rock. They became the fleshy, calcified folds of something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting, dormant, for eons, now stirring. I was not in an abandoned mine. I was within the burgeoning consciousness of a cosmic horror, a single, insignificant cell within its awakening form. It wasn't just coming. It was already here, woven into the fabric of space, patiently, meticulously, reshaping the world from within. And I, Raj, had been the one to call its attention, to open the door, to offer up my world as its new skin. The descent into the abandoned mine was a surrender. Each step was a commitment, a deeper plunge into the heart of the world, where the signal I knew had found its anchor. My clarity, born from the shards of my shattered mind, was a terrible gift, allowing me to perceive the seams of reality fraying, the impossible angles pressing in on the familiar. The tunnel narrowed, the rock walls closing like a suffocating embrace. Here, the dampness was not just moisture, it was a sheen that reflected my headlamp in unsettling ways. Not as a single point, but as fractured facets, scattered across the stone like broken glass. I reached out a hand, tracing the cool, slick surface. My fingers encountered not a flat plane, but a subtle, sickening curve where no curve should be, a convex bulge that defied the straight line of the tunnel. I pulled my hand back, a tremor running through my arm. The geometry was not merely perceived, it was present. Further in, the air grew warmer, thick and still, as if the very atmosphere had ceased to circulate, congealed into a viscous fluid. The low hum grew into a resonant thrum that vibrated in my chest cavity, rattling my bones. I had to see. I had to understand the impossible truth that had unmade my world. The tunnel opened abruptly into a vast natural cavern. My headlamp, now a futile spark, struggled against the immensity. The walls here were not merely rock, they were shifting. It was a visual dissonance, a constant, subtle rearrangement of perspective that made my stomach clench. In the center of this cavern, where the thrumming was a palpable pressure against my skin, stood what I can only describe as an absence. It was a locus, a point where the non-Euclidean signal had achieved its most profound manifestation. My headlamp beam, when directed at it, did not illuminate. Light bent around it, through it, and somehow into it, without revealing any discernible form. It was a knot in existence, a tear in the fabric of Euclidean space. But I saw it. With my broken mind, now terrifyingly clear, I perceived its true nature. It was a structure of pure, inconceivable geometry. Not lines and angles that could be drawn, but an architecture of concept. Shapes folded back on themselves in impossible ways, dimensions interpenetrating without collision. It was a cube that was simultaneously a sphere, a line that was infinite in all directions at once, a point that contained universes. It was the absolute antithesis of everything I knew, everything that governed our reality. And it was growing. Slowly, imperceptibly, the impossible geometry was expanding, not outward into the cavern, but inward into the very essence of existence. It was not consuming space. It was redefining it. The subtle warping of the mine walls, the fractured reflections, these were merely echoes, the nascent tendrils of this fundamental reordering. The malevolent consciousness wasn't an entity with eyes or limbs. It was the intent behind this geometry, the relentless alien will to impose its own incomprehensible structure upon all things. My breath hitched. The truth, when it finally settled, was not a shock, but a devastating confirmation. This wasn't an external threat, a being to be fought. This was a fundamental truth about the universe that had been hidden, now unveiled. And the signal, this entity, was simply peeling back that skin, revealing the true horrific nature of what lay beneath. It wasn't destroying my world. It was simply correcting it, aligning it with the geometry that had always been, waiting to manifest. The air in the cavern shimmered, not with heat, but with a perceptual distortion that made my eyes ache. My vision flickered, the solid rock walls momentarily dissolving into patterns of impossible tessellations, then snapping back to their familiar, deceptive forms. I was witnessing the genesis of a new reality, an imposition so profound it would rewrite the very rules of perception, of existence itself. and I, Raj, stood at its precipice, utterly broken, utterly clear, a prophet of the impossible truth, watching the collapse of everything. My world was not ending. It was being remade into something that would forever defy human comprehension, a nightmare of infinite, unanswerable angles. The damp earth still clung to my boots, a clinging memory of the depths. Yet the air around me felt impossibly thin, too bright. My headlamp, forgotten and still strapped, cast a feeble, useless glow into the vast, indifferent morning. A faint tremor ran through me, not of cold, but of a profound internal shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. They found me slumped against a gnarled pine, its bark rough beneath my cheek. A colleague, his face etched with worry lines I hadn't noticed before, knelt beside me. "Raj, are you all right? We've been looking for you all night." His voice was a distant murmur, a sound filtered through layers of impossible geometry that now seemed to overlay the world. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt thick, a foreign object in my mouth. What words could possibly encapsulate the truth? Down there, in the absolute blackness, where the rock walls pressed in like the very fabric of existence, I had not merely found the signal's origin. I had become it, or rather, it had become me. The world, as I knew it, was a fragile illusion. I saw it now, in the way the sunlight fractured through the pine needles, not into discrete rays, but into overlapping non-Euclidean facets that shimmered with a logic utterly alien to human understanding. His eye sockets were too deep, his mouth a curve that threatened to pinch into a point. The geometry, I rasped, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "It's everywhere." He frowned, his brow furrowing into lines that twisted and untwisted with a sickening fluidity. "Geometry, Raj? You're disoriented. We need to get you somewhere warm, get you some food." He reached for me, his hand a blur of motion, its shape subtly elongating, then contracting, before it made contact with my shoulder. The touch was not unpleasant, but it felt like a ripple across a surface that was not truly solid. I flinched, not from pain, but from the unbearable rightness of his hand's impossible movement. It wasn't that I saw things wrong. It was that I saw them as they truly were. Stripped of the comforting Euclidean lie, the air itself was a lattice of unseen lines, bending and curving around objects, creating pockets of space that were both here and not here. The ground beneath my feet was not flat, but gently, imperceptibly undulating, a slow, cosmic breath. It wasn't a signal, I managed, my voice gaining a desperate urgency. It was a process. It's not trying to transmit, it's trying to impose. They helped me up, their combined efforts feeling like a push and a pull from directions that weren't quite opposite. Each step was a navigation through a subtly altered landscape. The path leading away from the abandoned mine seemed to stretch and compress with my gaze, the trees along its edge leaning at angles that were both natural and deeply unsettling. I saw the shadow of a bird overhead, and for a fleeting moment, its form was not a simple silhouette but a complex, multidimensional projection. Its wings beating in a rhythm that was not merely up and down, but in and out of planes I could barely perceive. I hadn't discovered an external threat. I had become an internal witness, a living lens through which the transformation began to unfold. They led me towards a waiting vehicle, its metal shell shimmering with a strange liquid quality, its tires seeming to sink into the gravel with an impossible weight. The world was not collapsing in a sudden cataclysm, but subtly, insidiously, reforming itself according to the dictates of an alien geometry. And I was the only one who could truly see it. The horror wasn't in the destruction, but in the quiet, undeniable change, a slow, creeping imposition that would go unnoticed by everyone else. My sanity, once a fortress, was now a window, wide open to the terrifying, beautiful truth. It wasn't over. It had just begun. And I was alone, a babbling prophet of a subtle cosmic transformation, trapped in a reality that was no longer mine, but theirs. The abandoned mine had been a gateway, and I had walked through it, emerging into a world that was both the same and utterly, horrifyingly new. The volunteer's grip was strangely firm, yet his fingers felt like they might unravel into threads of light at any moment. My colleague, his face a mask of concern that seemed to ripple like water, kept his arm around my shoulder, guiding me forward. The ground beneath us was no longer solid earth, but a fractured plane of shifting angles, each step a descent into an impossible slope. We were in the abandoned mine, its maw now a gaping, irregular wound in the rock face, exhaling a chill that was more than just cold air. It was the breath of the void itself, now made tangible. "Just a little further, Raj," the colleague murmured, his voice a comfort that arrived a fraction of a second too late, as if the sound had to travel through a twisted dimension before reaching my ears. The volunteer nodded, his uniform pockets indeed folding inward, vast and lightless, like miniature black holes sewn into fabric. I could feel a profound, silent hum vibrating through the soles of my boots, a resonance that was not geological, but something else entirely. The deep, slow thrum of existence being rewritten. We stumbled deeper into the tunnel, the crude timber supports overhead bending into shapes that defied the very concept of a straight line. Shadows clung to the walls, not as mere absence of light, but as solid, geometric entities, twisting around the flicker of the colleague's lantern. I had seen the signal, understood its implications in theory, but to witness its physical manifestation was to have my very being scraped raw. This wasn't just a place. It was a living diagram, a proof of a theorem that unmade the universe. "The others are waiting," the volunteer said, his words echoing again, bouncing off surfaces that weren't there, or off surfaces that were, but shouldn't be. I looked at him, truly looked. His eyes, though focused on me, held a distant, unsettling calm. A calm that suggested not peace, but an utter lack of resistance to the encroaching forms. He saw the world as it was becoming, not as it had been. We rounded a bend where the tunnel widened into a vast cavern. My gaze swept across the expanse, and my heart, though it refused to pound in any cliché way, felt as though it were being slowly squeezed into a new, unfamiliar shape. Other searchers were there, a dozen or so figures huddled around a makeshift fire, their faces illuminated by its orange glow. But the fire itself was wrong. As I watched, a man by the fire reached out a hand to warm it. His arms stretched, elongating impossibly, his fingers splaying into a fan of bone and skin that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Yet he seemed utterly unaware, pulling his hand back as if nothing unusual had occurred. Another, a woman, spoke to a colleague, and her words, though audible, seemed to emanate not from her mouth, but from a point in space several feet above her head. Their laughter, when it came, was a series of overlapping dissonant chords. This wasn't merely a distortion of space, a change in the physical laws. This was a deeper invasion. The geometry was not just twisting the mind, or the bodies within it. It was twisting their very minds. Their perception of reality had been subtly, irrevocably altered. They saw the impossible, yet registered it as ordinary. They had been remade from the inside out. They're fine, my colleague said, following my gaze. His voice was laced with a strange, almost serene conviction. Just a little disoriented from the search. It's a vast place, this mine. He gestured with his free hand, and for a terrifying moment, I saw not 5 fingers, but 6, before my own eyes, or perhaps his hand, snapped back to the familiar. This was it. The revelation. The true horror. The entity was not merely imposing its geometry, it was teaching it. It was infecting thought itself, making the impossible seem rational, folding the fabric of consciousness until it accepted the new rules without question. It was a victory not of conquest, but of redefinition. I pulled away from my colleague, stumbling towards the fire, my determination curdling into a desperate, futile rage. "No," I rasped, my voice cracking. "This isn't real. None of this is real." The searchers around the fire turned their faces towards me, their expressions blank, uncomprehending. The fire's angular flames cast their faces in stark, impossible planes. One of them, a burly man with a thick beard, smiled. The smile was wide, stretching his mouth into a rectangle, his teeth a perfect, unsettling grid. "What isn't real, Raj?" he asked, his voice a smooth, flat surface. The air I breathed was not just air, but a lattice of invisible vectors. I looked at the colleague, at the volunteer, at the searchers. They were all still there, physically present, but the light in their eyes was different. It was the light of a mind that had accepted a new axiom, a new truth. Their thoughts, I knew, were now aligned with the entity's geometry. They saw the mind, the world, themselves, through its incomprehensible lens. I felt it then, a subtle shift within my own skull. A gentle pressure, a realignment. The panic that had been a raging storm within me began to subside, replaced by a strange, unsettling clarity. The old reality, the Euclidean certainty, felt suddenly restrictive, dull. I walked out of the abandoned mine, past the now perfectly square mouth of its entrance, past the trees whose branches formed impossible, self-intersecting loops. The sky above was a canvas of familiar blue, yet I saw the faint, shimmering lines of a new geometry woven into its expanse, a subtle, pervasive pattern. The distant mountains, once solid and immutable, now suggested a curvature that defied the Earth's sphere. I wandered, not lost, but newly found. The entity had not been defeated, nor had it been contained. It had simply expanded. The victory was complete, subtle, and utterly terrifying. The world continued, but it was no longer the same, and neither was I.